I'm Jeff Rosen, the president of this great institution, which is the only institution in America, chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful. Members of the Philosophical Society, you've heard the members of the Constitution Center reciting this inspiring mantra like congregants at a secular catechism. And who here is a member of the Constitution Center? Beautiful. Okay, wonderful. Well, all those of you... Sorry? A lecture about pardons here on a nonpartisan basis. You can listen to the podcast next week. The We the People podcast will talk about the arguments for and against whether a president can issue a self-pardon, and it turns out that there are indeed arguments on both sides, but check out We the People. All right, friends, we are gathered here tonight for a solemn and important purpose, and that is to welcome Patrick Spero, the head of the Philosophical Society, and our distinguished guest, Andrew O'Shaughnessy from Monticello, who will give a lecture on Jefferson and the spirit of inquiry and the idea of the university. Tomorrow at the Philosophical Society, Patrick Spero will sponsor an all-day conference on Jefferson and the age of inquiry, to which you're cordially invited. And I'm so excited to be able to host Andrew O'Shaughnessy, who's writing a book on this crucial question of Jefferson and the idea of the university. You've known from some of our previous conversations that the founders, and Jefferson was the preeminent representative of them, believe that we have certain faculties ranging from passion at the bottom to reason at the top. And we all have a duty to cultivate our faculties of reason so we are capable of personal and political self-government. And Andrew O'Shaughnessy will tell us about Jefferson's distinctive and democratic notion of the university as a place available to citizens of merit, but in a democratic spirit, regardless of economics and background and wealth. And it's going to be a riveting and crucial lecture, and I'm so excited to introduce it. The final plugs are for our last town halls of the season. On Monday, we're having a great conversation about the history and future of civil rights with a group of Guggenheim Fellows. And the following week, we have Larry Tribe on impeachment, and then Ben Rhodes for more on the self-pardons, and then Ben Rhodes, the President Obama's National Security Advisor, will be here the week after that. So join for all of those programs. Join the Constitution Center if you're not already a member, and please join me in welcoming the head of the American Philosophical Society, Patrick Spero.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Well, it's going to be hard to follow that animated introduction, and I don't have a solemn prayer that we all can say. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Patrick Spero. I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society. I run the library at the APS. We have over 13 million pages of manuscripts. We have the papers of Benjamin Franklin, the journals of Lewis and Clark, and we continue to collect. We have the papers of 7 Nobel laureates in our basement. And I would encourage you all to check out our museum. We have just opened a new exhibit celebrating our 275th anniversary. And that museum is on 5th Street, right next to Independence Hall. But tonight we're here to hear Andrew O'Shaughnessy speak. And I'd like to thank Jeff in particular for hosting our keynote. The conference is titled The Spirit of Inquiry in the Age of Jefferson. And it explores science, education, and knowledge in the earlier republic. And tonight's keynote by Dr. O'Shaughnessy is titled The Illimitable... Let me get it now. The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University. And in it, Andrew is going to talk about Jefferson's ideas about education and how important it is to have an educated citizenry in order to protect a democratic republic. And I can't think of a better institution in the country to hold that conversation than here at the National Constitution Center, where their mission is dedicated to advancing knowledge about the Constitution so that we today can have an educated citizenry that will protect our democratic republic. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you all at the National Constitution Center for what you do. And I also want to thank the conference's other co-sponsors. The Katz Center for Advanced Judaica Studies is sponsoring a special panel tomorrow at the American Philosophical Society on science and religion. And I'd also, of course, like to thank Monticello, who sponsored their own conference at Monticello 2 weeks ago, exploring education in the early republic And I'd especially like to thank Andrew O'Shaughnessy for the work he did organizing that conference and the efforts that he's put into this conference here. And in fact, the origins of this conference tonight began with an email exchange that Andrew and I had over a year ago. And what we said was 2018 is a really remarkable year for both of our institutions. In April of 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born. A month later, Benjamin Franklin proposed the creation of the American Philosophical Society, and he proposed it to promote useful knowledge. And so for 275 years, the APS has been advancing that mission. And Thomas Jefferson had a particularly important role in the APS's history. He served as the president of the American Philosophical Society for 17 years. He served as president of the APS while vice president and president of the United States of America. And we thought this was a great moment to come together as institutions to explore Jefferson, but also the idea of education, knowledge, and science in the early republic. And I think it's particularly fitting that we have Andrew joining us today because this is also the bicentennial of the founding of the University of Virginia. So there's 3 events all coming together. And of course, one of Jefferson's key contributions was the creation of UVA itself, which he founded to, as he said, promote useful knowledge. And so this idea of useful knowledge was so important to Jefferson in his time, and I think it's important to us today. And so I'm particularly excited to introduce Andrew O'Shaughnessy, who's going to be talking about Jefferson and his ideas about education. And for those of you that don't know Andrew, he is the vice president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and the Saunders director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. He's the author of 2 books. The first one, Empire Divided, explores the Caribbean during the American Revolution and asks that question, why didn't the Caribbean islands join with the Americans? It was a very provocative and insightful book. And his second book, The Men Who Lost America, was a highly acclaimed book. It received over 8 national awards, including the prestigious Washington Prize. And right now, Andrew's in the midst of writing his 3rd book, which is exploring Thomas Jefferson and education. And what he told me just this evening is that this is the first time he's given a public talk about his research. So he's testing out his ideas with us for the first time. And he said he expects a lot of very tough questions so that he can think through this project as he goes forward. So without any further ado, Andrew?
Thank you. That was very nice. Yeah. Well, I want to thank Jeff Rosen for that very spirited introduction, suitably spirited because this is the Spirit of Inquiry in the Age of Jefferson conference, and to thank Patrick. I'm feeling a little old because I was here in 2001 to 2002 as a fellow of the McNeill Center. It was a wonderful year. I was working on the British side of the American Revolution, and I would joke that I understood why the British became so enamored of Philadelphia and wanted to occupy it. But I have to say that Patrick and his now wife Laura were here on interview to become graduate students, and that's why I'm feeling somewhat old. But both have done splendidly. I hear wonderful reports both of your work with the American Philosophical Society in arranging programs and her work with the McNeill Center, which I'm particularly fond of and which is affiliated with the American Philosophical Society. I'd also like to thank Bob Hauser. I realized at the end of our dinner, at the end of our conference in Monticello, that we hadn't done any toasts, and we'd also run out of wine, which you can't do at a Jefferson event. So I ordered some dessert wine, and we poured it out. But at that time, the former speakers had had quite a bit of wine, and we did a Spirit to the American Philosophical Society that turned into a chant of APS. But it was certainly, it couldn't have been warmer for the feelings of Jefferson scholars towards the institution of which he was president. Now, Jefferson, on his tombstone, said he wished to be remembered for 3 things. The first was author of the Declaration of Independence. The second was similarly the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which is really still regarded as the basis for the interpretation of the First Amendment ideas on religious freedom. And the third was father of the University of Virginia. And I was invited to do a book about his founding of the University of Virginia by the University of Virginia Press for their bicentenary, which they're officially going to celebrate next year in 2019. But I'd already been thinking about this project, and my reason for studying it was really not the bicentenary. The bicentenary is the pretext. I now regard it as problematic because I don't want necessarily to publish the book in 2019. I'm enjoying the research too much. It is, as both Jeff and Patrick mentioned, it is a work in progress, so I'm going to rehearse some of the major arguments behind the book. But what attracted me to working on this was Jefferson's interest in education and his belief in a public education. He really wanted to have a university which was free. That was his first idea. And as we'll see, the university was only part of a much broader educational vision. And what I find remarkable about that is that today we consider Jefferson really as a libertarian, as anti-government. And he can be claimed by libertarians, except in respect to education, he was actually envisaging a massive increase in government. You have to realize there really wasn't such a thing as a state school education system. Massachusetts came very close. The Puritans had wanted schools in every town, but it was hit and miss. Scotland was probably the best anywhere, and part of the success of Scottish students was that they had an education system which was almost top-heavy for their country. They had more universities than Britain, and Scottish graduates went out throughout the world. And there were German experiments in public education, which I'm going to talk about because the German ones, places like the University of Göttingen and Halle University, were some of the most advanced. But as we'll see, they had a very different idea of what a public system should be from Jefferson. I mean, it was remarkable. If Virginia had adopted some of his ideas, it would have been really the first state anywhere to have a truly public education. Certainly, his general ideas on education are to some extent acknowledged, and John Dewey, one of the most important thinkers of education in the 20th century, looked to Jefferson, quoted Jefferson. But his ideas for a university are certainly not today regarded on a parallel with his ideas about religion and his ideas about independence. Indeed, like the Declaration of Independence, it has to be conceded that his loftier aspirations for a university were not fully realized in the institution that he created. He wanted a free university. It ended up being the most expensive university in America during the antebellum period. It was more expensive than Harvard, even though it was being continuously receiving public support. In lieu of making it free, he wanted to have academic scholarships, but it would be another 25 years before the university moved gingerly towards having academic scholarships. In order to create his university, he essentially had to reallocate money that had been initially intended for a primary school system to create what you might argue was a very elitist university and to deprive the rest of the state of their schools. And Jefferson actually said that he felt the primary schools were more important than the university, and he never gave up, as we'll see, on his interest in primary education. Jefferson spoke about the illimitable freedom of the human mind, and yet he was extremely ideological and doctrinaire about the way that law and politics should be taught. He felt very strongly that his Federalist opponents represented a heretical view of the American Revolution, which was monarchical and aristocratic. And he was very worried that Southerners were going north for their education, especially to Princeton. About a third of their students were Southerners, and to other northern institutions, and that they were being infected by these federalist ideas. Therefore, he wanted to make sure they were truly grounded in Republican ideas. He wanted to train, most of all, national and state leaders, what he called a natural aristocracy. But the university ended up teaching the leadership of the Confederacy. The cabinet of the Confederacy, the Senate of the Confederacy, the House of Representatives had a disproportionate number of UVA graduates. Jefferson talked about slavery as this abominable entanglement, and yet, of course, the university would be built by slaves, and slavery, which he hoped would gradually dissipate as the country moved westward, remained part of the university right through to the Civil War. Therefore, perhaps it shouldn't be surprising to find that the most current writer on the history of higher education in America before World War II, Roger Geiger, is actually very dismissive of Jefferson's experiment. He says this was nothing more than a finishing school for Southern aristocrats and an academic beacon for the South. Now, an academic beacon in any other context should sound good, but I think he's actually being disparaging. He elsewhere says that the university, and it's actually a remarkably good book in terms of its comprehensive coverage of American higher education, but he says that the university was no model for any other universities, and it was sui generis. It was completely different, but again, I think he's being very negative. What I want to do in this lecture is to argue that Jefferson's ideas of education were indeed revolutionary, that they were on a par with all of his other great achievements. And I will suggest that his ideas for a university specifically were distinct to being almost unique within America, slightly less unique in the context of Europe. And that the reason that they're no longer fully appreciated is either that they gradually disappeared from the University of Virginia, that they ceased to continue some of his ideas, or they've become so common to the education system of the United States that we simply take them for granted. And I want along the way to really highlight, firstly, the remarkable personal achievement that this represented for a man who was essentially, the period in which he worked at the university was the last 10 years of his life, from the age of 73 to 83. It was a remarkable personal achievement, but I also want to suggest the incredible ingeniousness and creativity of his ideas about a university, which I wouldn't suggest necessarily as a prescription to modern universities, but as we rethink what universities should be doing, as we recognize universities are in crisis with the cost of higher education, in some ways they can still be inspirational. Let me first just mention the remarkable personal achievement. Jefferson, in those last 10 years of his life, was ailing. He'd already wounded his right hand. By anecdote, it was always claimed in oral tradition that he did so trying to impress Maria Cosway in Paris and jumped over a wall and hurt his arm. The fact is he wounded his arm later on and would describe how difficult it was to write letters, that it was incredibly painful to do really anything with his hand. At one point, he got what the doctors at UVA tell me it was almost certainly a Staph's infection, in which he couldn't sit down easily and would literally have to lie on his front to read. This was a time when he was surrounded by family and grandchildren, and yet he played a role as founder that I cannot think of another example. I mean, you can certainly look at places like Rice University and found founders who played a major role in the founding of the university, but it's worth remembering that Jefferson actually surveyed the land as the son of a surveyor on which the university would be placed. We actually have a description by his former overseer, Edmund Bacon, who was interviewed later in life, describing Jefferson getting out his measuring instruments and doing this. As a lawyer and a former lawyer, he drafted nearly all of the legislation for the University of Virginia. I mean, in many ways, he was a brilliant draftsman, and part of his success as a politician had been as a rhetorician, writing the Declaration of Independence, but also drafting bills. It really shows his brilliance as a politician. There was huge opposition to the building of this university. It was a 6-year process, essentially. And the major reasons for opposition was firstly location. There were another 3 universities already in Virginia: Hampden, Sydney, the University of Washington, which is now Washington and Lee in Lexington, and the University of William and Mary, where he had graduated. They were not pleased to see another university. The University of Washington was very well endowed. It already had impressive buildings. It could claim to be in some ways more central. Remember, Virginia in this period also included West Virginia, which became a separate state during the Civil War. There was the issue of the cost, which was immense, and that's something I'm going to come back to later, because it's very difficult to think of a politician today spending so much on the architecture of a building and really building something from scratch at such immense cost. And then his views on religion. And again, I'll come back to this, but Jefferson had been described as an atheist in the election of 1800, and as we'll see, he had a very different idea of the role of religion in the curriculum and in the university. And it was particularly opposed by the Presbyterians in Stanton, who were the dominant group in American universities throughout the country. Most universities in this period were being founded by religious groups, and that is true historically. Even the language we use in universities, words like dean, even the ceremonies like the graduation process, are basically secularized forms today of religious origins. The Catholic Church, of course, had been critical during the medieval period. Jefferson was the designer of the university as an architect. But what is even more remarkable, if you see the detail of his work, is he calculated the number of bricks for each building. He gave estimates as to what each building would cost. He personally corresponded with some of the stonemasons and craftsmen and actually chose them. And in fact, some of his former employees at Monticello, like Dinsmore and Nielsen, were the people who worked on the university. Then there was Jefferson's intellectual impact on the university. He helped choose the professors. He helped choose the curriculum. He wrote out lists of books for the library. He would go down and visit the university almost every other day when he was still in good health. And in fact, his very last visit was to the library, which he felt was most important. And I love this anecdote. He was helping the librarian unbox the books. And this is the level of detail. And the books that were arriving were Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And I can't help but say the first volume of that book, that series, came out in 1776. And a lot of people in Britain were saying, this is us, this is our demise. And Jefferson looked at the books and said, the Tooler has put an E on the end of Gibbon. He's misspelled Gibbon's name, send it back. And then he even wrote the minutes of the Board of Visitors Those are in his hand. He invited the students, nearly the entire first-year class that he lived to see. He invited them up to Monticello every Sunday evening. And those who in conscience said they couldn't come on a Sunday for religious reasons, he'd invite during the week. The professors he had up regularly to visit Monticello and got to know them really quite well. Robert Douglason, the professor of medicine, became his doctor and was with him during the last hour of his life. And finally, in his very last month, he was planning a botanical garden at the university with one of the professors, Professor Emmett, in detail. And it never stopped. And what I also want to emphasize is that his ideas for an education, for a university, were merely the apex of a much broader vision of education, which begins in the American Revolution. And I'm not going to have time to get into the sources of his ideas, which are multifarious, as with everything with Jefferson, but clearly a very important influence was the American Revolution. And it's significant that he put forward his first proposal for public education during the American Revolution. He was thinking about it in 1776. He wrote it up as a bill in 1779. It was called the Bill and would become the Act for the General Diffusion of Knowledge. And it was part of this idea of creating a Republican informed citizenry, because he recognized if you were going to have people voting, if you were going to have government by the people needed to be educated, the people needed to hold government accountable. The system is remarkable because he proposed, and remember, 1779 is the first year in which the British tried to invade Virginia. So that, you have troops arriving in Virginia, and Jefferson planning the future, not only of Virginian education, but what he hoped would be American education. He was just assuming the American victory. It was a pyramid system in which there would be education for free boys and girls for the first few years of their life. So it's significant that he included women, because that was generally a blind spot in his general view of education, that he only included women at the basic level. Then they would go on to grammar schools, and this would be based on selection. And finally, the very best, it was a pyramid system, would go on to the university. It reminds me very much of British education at the time that I was born. He told George Wythe, his former professor, that he regarded this as the most important of all of the codes that he put in front of the Assembly during the American Revolution. In 1794, he actually suggested that America hire the entire faculty of the University of Geneva, which was being disbanded in the wake of the French Revolutionary Wars. This remained on his mind. Originally, he thought that he would simply reform William and Mary College, but he felt William and Mary College was so dominated by Anglicans who became Episcopalians that there was really no hope, although he did remove the chairs in divinity at William and Mary and added chairs in medicine and law and even in chemistry, which was incredible for this period. In 1800, he first wrote to Joseph Priestley, who was a major influence on him and is regarded as the father of Unitarianism, as well as the scientist who really discovers oxygen, and said that he was thinking of a University of Virginia. That's really the first mention. In 1802, as president, he created West Point for the army. And people are always surprised that Jefferson, who's sometimes regarded as almost pacifist, would be the father of West Point. And we realized that later he wanted West Point to be part of a national university. In fact, in 1806, he tried to get a constitutional amendment for creating a national university, which had been an idea of George Washington that Jefferson had supported. And Jefferson essentially was willing to see the federal government create a university. Jefferson also mentions at one point that the federal government might even finance scientific research. But Jefferson gradually gives up on both the idea of national university, on the idea of reforming William and Mary. He's retired for about 4 years and had not really taken any initiative at all in education. And in 1814, supposedly as a result of a hapchance of walking into Court Square in Charlottesville and finding the board of the local, what was to be the local high school called the Albemarle Academy, that had really never been created, Jefferson was made a member of the board and produced a plan for that, what was basically going to be a high school. What is remarkable about the plan is it's almost the same plan that he produced for the University of Virginia. The whole idea of the lawn, of this layout is contained in that plan, although the buildings were not so grand. But you get the sense that Jefferson, almost from the beginning, was thinking about usurping this into creating the University of Virginia. And that impression becomes even greater when he manages to persuade this board to disband themselves and to reform as Central College, Virginia. And the word central is very important because the idea that this would be central in the state of Virginia, and therefore the natural place to have the University of Virginia. And as he also makes the board much smaller with Central College, which means it can be more easily politically dominated. It's about this time that he begins to work with someone called Joseph Cabell, who seems to have very little politically in common with Jefferson, but who shared his passion for education. And Cabell played the same role in the legislature that Madison played in Congress during the 1790s. Cabell was his front man, and Jefferson deliberately stayed behind the scenes. And by 1816 and 1817, they were persuading the legislature to think of creating a university. The legislature appoints commissioners to be what becomes known as the Rockfish Gap Commission, that basically puts forward proposals for a university. Now, thanks to the Jefferson Papers retirement series, we have a lot of insights. Most historians have just published and used the final commission report. We've got Jeff Looney in the audience, who's the editor of the retirement series, which we do at Monticello. And they looked at a lot of earlier drafts in Jefferson's hand. Now, this is Jefferson at his best as a politician, because at the Rockfish Gap Commission, Rockfish Gap, incidentally, is in the mountains between the east and the west. And the commissioners met and supposedly produced a report which Jefferson had already written. And we've always known that Jefferson had already written the report, which they just rubber stamped. What we hadn't known, though, was that he had a lot of earlier drafts which are very difficult to read. There's a lot of cut and paste, and you have to look under. He literally puts paper above paper with different lines underneath each of them. Jefferson gradually improved his argument as to why the university should exist, why it should be in Charlottesville. But in the final version of the report, he removed a lot of the arguments for why it should be in Charlottesville. He'd even made the claim that the water's better in Charlottesville than places like Stanton or Richmond, which would have been the natural place for it. So I want to basically just give you some of the highlights of Jefferson's ideas that appear in the Rockfish Gap and that eventually materialize. And then I finally want to end with what is really distinctive and revolutionary about this university in the early years and about his vision. It is a marvelous vision of a university. The most remarkable aspect that has been written about most is the actual architecture. one of the things that stands out to me most, and Jefferson, remember, designed it, and he called on the two architects of Washington, D.C., two of the leading ones, William Thornton and Benjamin Latrobe, to give him advice, and Latrobe may indeed have been responsible for the principal building, the rotunda, and he communicated with them and got advice, but a lot of it was his own design. And what is incredible is the sheer expense, and I've been unable so far to get any architectural historian to compare it to other buildings in the period, but the only comparison I can think of is the building of Washington, D.C. itself. I've looked at universities like the University of North Carolina, and they were built incrementally. Jefferson insisted the entire university be built immediately. And one of the arguments, and any academics in the audience will love this, one of his arguments is if you want to attract the best minds and the best brains, you better have it all in place. No one's going to come from Europe to a log cabin. It better look magnificent. In the end, he was importing marble from Italy because he found that the local, he'd already brought Italian sculptors over to carve the capitals, which would go at the top of the columns, but he discovered the local marble wasn't good enough. He built it of stone and brick rather than wood, and it was on an incredible scale, and it was also to be of educational value. He wanted the buildings to teach students about classical architecture. You'd have the Corinthian styles, the Ionic styles, the Doric styles, so they learnt the difference, and they learnt the best taste. And this was the theme throughout, that the University of Virginia would have the very best. It would have the very best faculty. He sent a young man called Francis Walker Gilmer, after trying to recruit faculty in America, including the Reverend Samuel Knox in Maryland, and trying some of the New England schools. He eventually gave up, and he wasn't willing to have anything that was secondary to Harvard or what we today think of as the Ivy League schools. He sent this young man, Francis Walker Gilmer, who he regarded as one of the brightest people in Virginia and really one of the people who would lead the next generation, over to England to select the professors. He designed pavilions, and the whole idea of the layout was what he called an academical village, in which students and professors lived among each other. These larger buildings on the left and right, although they look symmetric, are all different. And those would be the homes of professors. And I always like to point that out as to how professors lived in the past. They're now the homes of deans, which tells you a lot about what has happened at universities. But he wanted the very best, and he was paying some of the highest salaries in America at the time. The curriculum, a lot of people today characterize it almost as though it was a STEM. And there's no doubt that there was a huge emphasis on science, and chemistry was included. But on the other hand, he regarded Anglo-Saxon as crucial, which I don't think would be true of most STEM projects today. He thought Anglo-Saxon was important, firstly because you would learn about early political systems that had a republican element. Secondly, because it was crucial if you want to know about the law, to understand the earliest origins of the law. And thirdly, if you wanted to understand our language, it's based on Anglo-Saxon before the Latinate additions, and that this was crucial in order to learn part of the way to communicate. It was the first university in America to have a department of economics, the department of medicine, under Robert Douglas, and we just had at this last conference a speaker, he's one of the top heart surgeons at the university, and Robert Gibson. And he said Jefferson and Douglas essentially anticipated the Flexner Report of 1910, which still is the main code that guides both the ethics and the conduct of medicine in this country. Jefferson believed in an empirical view of medicine, only doing what what you have evidence to do, not speculating or theorizing without real evidence support, and not intervening. He felt the body was better healing itself than intervening. And Gibson gave a very amusing talk in which, of course, he referred to Benjamin Rush up here in Philadelphia, which was regarded as the most advanced place for medicine at the time. And Rush, of course, was the great believer in bloodletting. And the first journal of medicine was called The Lancet, which I'd never really thought about before. But that is absolutely contrary to Jefferson's idea of a university. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the university was the treatment of religion. He wanted no chapel and no department of theology. Religion was to be taught as history. And he invited initially a man called Thomas Cooper, who was this English radical, an incredibly broadly educated man, but really a Unitarian and disciple of Priestley. He wanted him desperately to be on the faculty, to the point that he actually appointed him before the university was even in session or ready to go in session. He was forced to give up on Cooper, who eventually went to South Carolina. But it was remarkable that he would try Cooper, who would never have been employed in any of the northern colleges. Remember, places like Harvard and the northern schools and Yale were still largely producing clergy and ministers, and theology was still the major form of training. His ideas of administration were very radical. He didn't want a hierarchy. He didn't want a president and didn't want a dean. The faculty were supposed to be kind of self-governing. And I'm very amused, Alexander von Humboldt, who was a German thinker on education, said having a faculty run themselves is like asking a group of actors to direct their own plays. And then with the students, similarly, he wanted a sort of self-government among the students, which is very consistent with his political philosophy, along with rigorous exams, as he supposedly cried when the first class of the students rioted. All these foreign imported academics. But the honor system, which is now so integral to the University of Virginia, was not introduced originally, but it certainly represents Jefferson's idea. And he even wanted a maison française, a French house. He wanted one of the hotels, essentially the cafeterias where the students dined. He wanted those to have French-speaking staff who didn't know any English, in order that the students would learn French. And my favorite idea, I said I think it's very ingenious, his ideas. My favorite is for the Rotunda, which was his principal building. It was based on the Pantheon in Rome, and essentially wanted a planetarium, or what more accurately Doug Hansberger has called a huge blackboard for astronomy. But in this dome would be a mechanical chair with a saddle on it with stirrups, and the professor, who would literally ride almost like Star Wars through the planets, giving lectures. And it was based on something, interestingly, that an event, that a dome that Jefferson had first seen shown in lights while he was with Maria Cosway. So let me just conclude, because I'm pretty well out of my time, by saying that actually Jefferson's ideas were indeed sui generis, but in ways that have been very important for education since. Firstly, it's one of the first true public education, true public universities. Now, William and Mary regards itself as a public university, but John Whitehead some years ago did a book on public universities, pointing out that they were actually, the position of universities was very ambiguous in the 17th and 18th centuries. Even though they'd all had large amounts of public money, they were also private, and they didn't receive regular money from the public. Dartmouth in the early 1830s had a famous case where it claimed it was a private university, but even they were largely arguing for autonomy rather than claiming that they were public. And other universities like Harvard were still asking for public money, and Columbia right up until the Civil War. They didn't necessarily see themselves as either public or private. One of the features of the University of Virginia, it was the first of 2 universities that received money annually from the public. And I want to make a distinction. The only other real public universities were France and in Germany, universities like Göttingen and Halle. But there's a big difference. Those universities were conceived as serving the interest of the state. They were to produce bureaucrats for the state. Whereas Jefferson, in fact, wanted to produce leaders who would push back against the state. And when they were leaders and politicians, would really represent their citizenry and not overextend. They would be virtuous leaders who didn't abuse their powers. Another key feature, which was in many ways a first in America, was Jefferson's idea of an elective curriculum. My father, who taught at Columbia University, called it the American smorgasbord approach to education, where you pick and choose what courses you wanted to follow. Virginia was the first. Jefferson emphasized vocational education. He even wanted to have skilled craftsmen on the campus, or what's called the grounds in Virginia. He wanted to have skilled craftsmen so students could wander into their shops and learn some skilled trades. Obviously, he wanted to have very vocational subjects like law and medicine taught. The university, I've already mentioned, really represents the realization of Jefferson's separation of religion. The reason, though, that it's not fully recognized is later the university would distance itself. Even during the Rockfish Gap Commission, Jefferson was basically forced to agree to have a room where people could have religious services, even they wanted the actual different churches on the outskirts, but none of them accepted that invitation until YMCA in 1845. Nevertheless, gradually, later on, the university did have a chapel, it did have a department of theology. Jefferson's method of governance was unusual in being flat and having no president. But today, the University of Virginia has a president. His idea of pedagogy and his emphasis not on rote learning, but on lectures and interaction with the faculty, today is obviously highly widespread. Jefferson, incidentally, originally wanted only about very short breaks. The university would teach virtually throughout the year. Jefferson obviously put great emphasis on the arts, just in terms of the architecture, and people really becoming familiarized. The most controversial argument is that Jefferson had a meritocratic view of education, which does distinguish himself from the Federalists. This obviously has to be qualified. He was challenged about the education of women, and he rather pathetically said, "I've not really given that much thought," which is not good because Mary Wollstonecraft had been writing. There were people talking about the education of women and colleges educating women. Enslaved people and free blacks were not included. Nevertheless, by the standard of his day, it's very remarkable. I just want to quote when he tried his final bill to get a public education system, more broadly in the state in 1817. He wrote to the Abbé Correia, who was really one of the great Portuguese intellectuals who stayed regularly in Monticello, and said, "The object is to bring into action the mass of talents which lie buried in every country for want of the means of development." People just don't have the opportunities. We need to give them those opportunities. I would say the university did have a real impact. It had a huge impact in the South, places like the University of Texas and Alabama, and their historians testify to this. A lot of UVA graduates went on to be presidents of universities like Missouri, but not just only in the South. in London. The University of London was the first founded outside of Oxford and Cambridge, and was specifically founded as a non-denominational university. One of the key minds behind that was Lord Brougham, and one of the people that Jefferson had Francis Walker Gilmer meet with and consult was Lord Brougham, who was a leading London radical. I think certainly the architecture of the university you can see in lots of places, including in Beijing, in the University of Tsinghua, which is very similar to the University of Virginia. My first year in America was teaching at SMU, which has a lot of similarities. Certainly Dallas Hall at the center looks very much like the rotunda of the University of Virginia. I think as I finish this book, I may even make a case that there's something very interesting happening in the South, which unfortunately is closed by the debate on slavery, and the South becoming more and more ideologically pro-slavery. But until that happens, the South is a leader in public education. The University of North Carolina claims to have the first charter as a public school. The University of South Carolina shares with Virginia the distinction of receiving public money each year. These universities, especially South Carolina and the University of Virginia, were open to having Unitarians and people who were not traditional, part of the traditional Christian denominations. They emphasized science and vocational training, and they all were very keen on this idea of student self-government and the honor system. I'm going to close by just quoting Jefferson writing to Caspar Wistar, who is the president of the American Philosophical Society, who are ultimately my hosts and who have the conference tomorrow. Jefferson consulted with a lot of people, which is why it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly who influenced the University of Virginia. Alexander von Humboldt, it was an international. Abbé Correa, who I've mentioned, Dupont de Nemours, the French who wanted to create an earlier public university in Richmond. And he consulted with Wistar, who'd been his vice president when he was president of the American Philosophical Society, and with whom he'd consulted during the Lewis and Clark expedition. And he said that he planned to establish an academy on a moderate scale, not true, but capable of enlargement to include useful science. And that was a favorite phrase of his: useful information, useful education. As an aid in planning this institution, he wished to know the organization of others which had attained celebrity. And considering the University of Philadelphia, first among these, he asked how the professorships were arranged and what subjects were included under each. Thank you very much.
I've lost my mic, so I will try and project like Jeff. I won't do his dance up here, though. I still can't do that. But we have time for a few questions, if there are any in the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
I'll repeat it.
Yeah, the question is, how does form and function relate to one another?
Yes, may I ask two? Yeah, now? Okay.
Yes.
Second is, what do you think Jefferson would think of today's extreme social justice warriors?
Well, certainly in terms of form and function, I'm going to be heretical myself, because one university, two universities that I know that follow his idea of the academical village are Oxford and Cambridge, that are both descended from religious institutions. I mean, they were part monastery and religious orders. The whole idea of fellowship, for example, and the idea of professors living among students. It was radical to have a residential university in this period. So this is another remarkable feature. And Jefferson himself, although he was very dismissive of William and Mary, he reminds me of Edward Gibbon, who was dismissive of Oxford, And then in his memoirs talks about his nightly walk with his tutor up the hill. And you realize this was a very privileged young man to get to walk with his professor every evening. And Jefferson, similarly, he spent a lot of time with William Small, who'd known all of the great figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. And they socialized. He went to William Small's dinners. He got to know George Wythe, who later became the first professor of law and a big influence on him. He went to Governor Fauquier, who was the acting governor of Virginia, and they'd have sort of symposiums together. And that's what he was in some ways trying to recreate. And the form is very important in terms of sort of bringing people together, not having one dominant building, as nearly all these other universities have, a big building, but really trying to create a community of scholars. In terms of what would he think about safe spaces and some of the current thing, I'm not, obviously, I always avoid that question. I remember a fellow scholar once, who's a Lincoln scholar, being asked something like, what would Lincoln have thought about aircraft? And he just said, what are aircraft? It's very difficult. And people love to play that role, and there are people who do it professionally, where they kind of act as this oracle and channel Jefferson for the current generation. But I mean, it's always fun to think about as an issue.
Thank you so much. We started with Jefferson and Franklin, and then we kind of ended with UVA and Penn. And I was just wondering, could you maybe talk about the relationship between Jefferson and Franklin and their concepts of a university, and UVA and Penn in their formation as both idea and practice?
Well, Patrick said at the beginning, I'm still on a fact-finding mission. And I'm hoping some members of the audience, I was expecting to find a lot more Franklin and Penn. And after all, Jefferson had seen the University of Pennsylvania while he was here, at least just as a member of Congress and on later visits. Franklin wrote a good deal about education even before the American Revolution. And we know that Jefferson, to some extent, modeled himself on Franklin. I mean, Franklin, and especially as an ambassador to Paris, he was very conscious of Franklin. We've got Philip Ziesch from the Franklin Papers here. I'm hoping to try and find more of a relationship. Clearly, the letter to Wistar is evidence that he really understood the University of Pennsylvania. He would have known, though, that the University of Pennsylvania was hurt in its early years by denominational differences between Presbyterians and Anglicans, and the same was true of Columbia, and this really affected their early development, and that's something that he wanted to avoid. In some ways, he was more concerned about denominations and the organization of religion than actually religious ideas, because he recognized, in some ways quite fairly, that they would want to gain a monopoly, and that's why no one took him up on his offer to create a university, to create a church on the outskirts of the university, because they all wanted either to run it or not to have anything to do with it.
Yes, sir.
Related to the cost of slavery in the university.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. When I visited the Edgar Allan Poe house in Richmond, Virginia, one of the things you find out is that Edgar Allan Poe was a student at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville for 1 year.
Yes.
His family was not able to pay for him to continue.
Yes.
He left the University of Virginia after 1 year. One thing one notices when visiting the campus at the University of Virginia is that some of these pavilions had slave quarters behind them, and students could arrive at the University of Virginia with their slaves to look after them.
Yes, although the slaves were not meant to accompany them. And there was a rule about that, but obviously the rules got bent. A lot of the, especially the wealthy planters, never completed their course of studies, and this is true at Oxford and Cambridge. They never actually do anything as crude as actually taking a degree, even though there were rigorous training. Poe, the universities actually recreated his room, which is quite fun. We know, though, very little about his time at the University of Virginia, but it's more than possible he went up and dined with Jefferson. I gave this talk in Chicago, and it was actually, it was a Jefferson topic, but not this. And someone arrived with a document, and it was basically Jefferson's invitation to a student to come to Monticello and dine with the Marquis de Lafayette. Because Lafayette visited twice in those final years, and Lafayette dined with Jefferson in the dome room before it had been completed of the University Rotunda. And of course, and everybody who described the scene, it was incredibly moving because they knew they were seeing the last of the greats. They were seeing the last of the founders. And very few other signers of the Declaration and significant figures were still alive other than John Adams. One of the other great features of this period when he's building the university was he was corresponding with John Adams, and a member of the Library of Congress described it at our symposium the other week as like a continual symposium, a ceaseless symposium, which I loved. There are few correspondences between great statesmen of such a level where they're not only just talking about politics, but all the great developments of their time in the sciences, in theology and in other fields.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you. I found your comment that you said later the South sort of closed around slavery very interesting. Does that mean that while Jefferson was still alive, I mean, I'll let you give us the dates, well, how were the feelings about slavery? Did the university have an official position on slavery, and how was there debate about slavery before this closing around slavery? Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how the university felt about slavery before what you describe as the closing around it?
Well, Jefferson spoke out against slavery more than any other founder. Washington freed his slaves on his death, but Washington never spoken out publicly against slavery. Jefferson did. I mean, it was in his notes on the state of Virginia, and he said, you know, if there's a God, America is eventually going to suffer for this sin. He's much more quiet later on in life, and it's worth recognizing that the world had changed. It reminds me a bit of 1968. There were things you could say in 1968 which you wouldn't necessarily say now. It was a different sort of freedom, and people were thinking in more utopian and revolutionary terms. Similarly, it was less easy for Jefferson to speak openly about religion. If he'd really come out against slavery in his later years, he could not have built the university. I mean, he couldn't have done anything that he did. Not even these, we're celebrating Hamilton downstairs and the Federalists, but the fact is they never spoke out openly. They never campaigned against slavery because they realized it would be impossible to get elected in this country by taking an overtly anti-slavery approach. In terms of the South, there does seem, and a number of historians have picked up on this, a brief window of time after the American Revolution when there was such a thing as Southern abolitionists. There was actually one figure in the South, a member of the Carter family, who freed all of his slaves, and he'd been one of the leading patriots before the American Revolution, on a par and been going to the Raleigh Tavern, and really a key member of the Virginia establishment. He was ostracized and had to go and live in Maryland. And of course, he was unable to have any impact on the society at all. But it's really with cotton becoming king and the success of cotton that ultimately helps to close any real debate. There was a sort of 15, 20-year period after the American Revolution when there was debate about this in the South, but with the 1830s and especially the 1840s, essentially you were forced to choose one side or another. It became so polarized.
Great. Great. Well, before we thank Andrew, I want to again invite everybody to continue this conversation tomorrow at the American Philosophical Society. The conference and the conversations will continue at 9 o'clock in Franklin Hall. And with that, I want to thank Andrew for a wonderful start to this.
Thank you very much.